Wisdom, wisdom, that's the test. Which rival wisdom team is best? 52 teams of 8 antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate, and entertain generations for centuries. Team 14, a lead authentically. Quote definitions, biographical context and synergy analysis to replace hate with motivational education to guidealife.com. Quote 14.1. Bravery never goes out of fashion. William Makepeace Thackeray, 1811 to 1863. Quote definition. Unlike political trends, social styles, and cultural preferences, which cycle endlessly in and out of relevance, bravery retains its value in every era, under every circumstance, and in every human context. The willingness to act rightly in the face of fear or opposition is permanently admirable because the conditions requiring it never disappear. Quote application. The work of replacing hate with wisdom requires bravery in every generation. The bravery to name hatred honestly, to stand against it publicly, to model kindness in hostile environments. Thackeray's principle is the assurance that this bravery is never wasted, never outdated, and never fails to matter, regardless of whether it is fashionable in a given moment. William Makepeace Thackeray was born in 1811 in Calcutta, India, where his father was a civil servant in the East India Company. His father died when Thackeray was 4, and he was sent to England to be educated. A lonely voyage that took 4 months and left a mark on his understanding of displacement and loss that shaped his fiction for the rest of his career. He was educated at Charterhouse School and briefly at Trinity College, Cambridge, which he left without a degree. He lost most of his inheritance in failed ventures. A newspaper he partly owned collapsed, his investments in an Indian bank were wiped out, and spent years as a journalist, illustrator, and struggling writer before Vanity Fair, serialized from 1847 to 1848, made him famous. Vanity Fair, subtitled A Novel Without a Hero, is saturated with the study of courage and its absence. Thackeray populated his fictional world with people who were brave in small social ways while being craven in large moral ones, and with the occasional figure, Dobbin, the patient and genuinely good soldier, whose bravery was quiet, unfashionable, and real. The observation that bravery never goes out of fashion reflects Thackeray's sustained engagement with the question of what genuine virtue looks like in a society that rewards the performance of virtue over its substance. He had watched fashionable society celebrate people whose bravery was mostly theatrical and dismiss people whose bravery was genuine but unremarkable. He concluded that the fashion cycle was irrelevant to the underlying value. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Practice bravery as a permanent virtue rather than a situational response to fashionable causes. It is needed in every era and every context. 2. Resist the temptation to calibrate moral courage to what is socially rewarded in a given moment. The reward for genuine bravery is not always contemporary recognition. 3. Recognize that the unfashionable bravery of standing against hatred, ignorance, or cruelty in unremarkable daily circumstances is as genuinely valuable as the celebrated bravery of dramatic moments. 4. Trust that bravery's permanent value means that no act of genuine courage, however small, however unnoticed, is wasted. Thackeray himself demonstrated a form of literary bravery unusual for his era. In Vanity Fair and elsewhere, he refused to give his audience the sentimental resolutions they expected and the villainous characters they wanted to hate without complication. His characters were morally mixed. Becky Sharp, his most famous creation, is simultaneously admirable and deplorable, and his refusal to simplify them for popular consumption was a sustained act of intellectual bravery that cost him some readers and earned him the respect of the best ones.
Quote 14.2. Don't let schooling interfere with your education. Mark Twain, 1835 to 1910. Quote definition. Formal schooling, the institutional transmission of approved knowledge through structured curricula, is not the same as genuine education, which is the broader, deeper, lifelong process of developing one's own understanding, judgment, and wisdom through experience, inquiry, and independent thought. The former can actually impede the latter if it trains compliance and credential-seeking at the expense of genuine learning. Quote application. The wisdom in these 52 teams is genuine education, in Twain's sense. not institutionally approved, not credentialed, not delivered through formal schooling, but drawn from 2,500 years of human experience and offered freely to anyone willing to think about it. The invitation is education in the deepest sense, learning that forms judgment and character, not merely knowledge that fills a test. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, Mark Twain, was born in 1835 in Florida, Missouri, and grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, on the banks of the Mississippi River. His formal schooling ended when his father died, and he went to work as a printer's apprentice at 11. He subsequently educated himself through the most comprehensive possible practical curriculum. Typesetter, Mississippi riverboat pilot, silver miner in Nevada, journalist in San Francisco and Hawaii, travel writer in Europe and the Holy Land, and eventually the most celebrated American writer of his era. He had no college degree. He had, instead, everything that Twain's own aphorism describes as education: direct experience, relentless observation, insatiable curiosity, and the willingness to form his own judgments regardless of what respectable opinion demanded. The critique embedded in the quote is serious, not merely witty. Twain had watched formal schooling produce graduates who could recite approved facts and reproduce approved opinions, but who were genuinely incapable of independent thought. People whose intellectual conformity made them reliable employees and unreliable citizens. He had also watched people with little formal schooling, river pilots, miners, frontier people of every description, develop the kind of practical wisdom, moral clarity, and genuine intelligence that no institution had conferred and no institution could take away. His own life was the most complete possible illustration of the distinction he was drawing. He had been educated in the fullest sense, and schooling had almost nothing to do with it. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Distinguish between schooling, formal institutional, credential granting, and education, the genuine development of understanding, judgment, and character. 2. Pursue genuine education actively, beyond and sometimes despite what formal institutions provide or require. 3. Resist the reduction of learning to credential-seeking. The degree is not the education, and confusing them produces people who have certificates but not wisdom. 4. Recognize that the most important education available, in wisdom, in human understanding, in moral judgment, is acquired through engaged living, not institutional attendance. Twain received honorary doctorates from Yale and Oxford late in his life, acknowledgments from the institutions of learning that his life had demonstrated he had never needed. He accepted them with characteristic irony, noting that the approval of establishments he had spent his career criticizing was a form of tribute he was happy to receive even if it came several decades late. He had been educated. The schooling was a footnote.
Quote 14.3. Remorse, the fatal egg that pleasure laid. William Cooper 1731–1800. Quote definition. Remorse is the inevitable consequence, the hatched egg, of pleasures pursued without regard for their moral cost. The pleasure comes first and seems complete. The remorse follows, as surely as a hatched egg follows fertilization, and its lethality lies in the fact that it cannot be undone once it has been born. Quote application. Every act of hatred, cruelty, or casual unkindness that feels satisfying in the moment lays an egg of remorse that will eventually hatch. Cooper's biological metaphor makes the connection both vivid and inevitable. The pleasure and the remorse are not separate events but a single biological sequence. This is the case for examining pleasures before indulging them. Some eggs are better left unhatched. William Cooper was born in 1731 in Great Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire, England, the son of a Church of England rector. His mother died when he was 6, and he was sent to boarding school where he experienced bullying severe enough that he later described it as the formative trauma of his life. He trained as a lawyer but suffered a series of profound mental breakdowns, including multiple suicide attempts, that prevented him from practicing. He found stability in evangelical Christianity and in the rural community of Olney, Buckinghamshire, where he collaborated with the former slave trader turned minister John Newton on the Olney Hymns, a collection that includes Amazing Grace, and eventually produced The Task, a long poem of rural observation and moral reflection that was enormously popular in its era. Cooper wrote about remorse from direct personal experience of devastating depth. His mental illness included periods of absolute conviction that he was personally damned, that God had specifically excluded him from salvation, a belief that produced a particular kind of remorse about his own existence that was entirely disproportionate to anything he had actually done. He understood the mechanism of remorse from the inside, how it hatches from the smallest acts of pleasure or selfishness and grows into something that consumes the person it inhabits. His aphorism captures with biological precision what his life experienced as psychological catastrophe. The egg is laid before the remorse is felt, and by the time it hatches, nothing can prevent it. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Examine pleasures, especially those involving the mistreatment or dismissal of others, before indulging them, because the remorse they generate is as inevitable as hatching. 2. Recognize that the felt satisfaction of cruelty, contempt, or unkindness is temporary, while the remorse it produces is more durable and harder to resolve. 3. Apply this principle to the pleasures of hatred specifically. The satisfaction of expressing contempt for a group lays an egg that, when fully examined, hatches into the recognition of one's own diminishment. 4. Use the prospect of remorse as a practical pre-decision tool. Would I be comfortable with the full consequence of this pleasure? Rather than waiting for the egg to hatch. Cooper's most famous hymn, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, was written on the day he had planned to drown himself in the river Ouse. According to the account, he called for a carriage to take him to the river, but the driver became lost in thick fog and could not find it. Cooper took this as a divine sign and returned home to write the hymn instead. Whatever the truth of the account, it captures something essential about his life. He had laid countless eggs of remorse through his own mental anguish, and he spent decades trying to write and pray his way to the peace that would keep them from hatching. He left some of the most beautiful religious poetry in the English language as evidence of the attempt.
Quote 14.4. The discipline of desire is the background of character. John Locke 1632–1704. Quote definition. Character, the stable, reliable expression of a person's values and virtues, is not formed by grand gestures or exceptional moments alone. It is built in the background, in the daily, unglamorous practice of disciplining desire, choosing what is right over what is immediately wanted, repeatedly, until the choice becomes the person. Quote application. Hatred is, among other things, an undisciplined desire, the desire to feel superior, to have a simple explanation for complex problems, to express contempt without consequence. Replacing hate requires the disciplined character that Locke describes, formed in the background of daily choices to pursue understanding rather than contempt, connection rather than division, wisdom rather than the satisfaction of easy prejudice. John Locke was born in 1632 in Rington, Somerset, England, the son of a country lawyer and small landowner who served as a cavalry officer in the parliamentary forces during the English Civil War. He was educated at Westminster School and Christ Church, Oxford, studied medicine, and became secretary and physician to Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, a leading Whig politician whose fortunes Locke followed through periods of both influence and exile. His most consequential works, an essay concerning human understanding, 2 treatises of government, a letter concerning toleration, and some thoughts concerning education, were largely written during a period of political exile in the Netherlands following the Rye House Plot of 1683, and published after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 brought his patron's faction to power. Locke's philosophy is most commonly associated with political theory. His arguments for natural rights, government by consent, and the right of revolution against tyranny were foundational to both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution. But his philosophical psychology was equally important and equally original. His essay concerning human understanding argued that the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and that all knowledge and character are formed through experience. This made education, and specifically the education of desire through discipline, the central mechanism of human development. The discipline of desire is the background of character not merely as moral prescription but as philosophical fact. For Locke, character literally is the accumulated product of disciplined choices, since there is no innate character to appeal to, only what experience has built. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Invest in the background work of character formation, the unglamorous daily discipline of desire, rather than waiting for exceptional moments to define who you are. 2. Recognize that the desires most requiring discipline are often the most immediate and most socially accepted. The desire for easy certainty, for contemptuous superiority, for the comfort of prejudice. 3. Understand that character is not revealed in crisis alone, but built in the daily choices that accumulate into the person who faces crisis. 4. Apply Locke's empirical principle. Since character is formed by experience, it can always be reformed by new experience. The discipline of desire is available at any age. Locke spent his years of Dutch exile in a community of religious refugees and intellectual dissenters, people who had fled persecution for their beliefs and who were building lives of principled resistance in difficult circumstances. He observed in them exactly what his philosophy predicted, that the people who had disciplined their desires for safety and social approval in favor of their convictions had built characters of unusual resilience and integrity. The background of their character was visible in the choices they had made repeatedly, under pressure, over years. He included that observation in his theoretical framework because he had seen it demonstrated in human lives.
Quote 14.5. None so deaf as those that will not hear. None so blind as those that will not see. Matthew Henry 1662-1714. Quote definition. The most profound and most impenetrable forms of deafness and blindness are not physical but volitional. The chosen refusal to hear what is uncomfortable and see what is inconvenient. Physical disability limits perception involuntarily. Willful ignorance chooses limitation as a strategy for avoiding what is true but unwelcome. Quote application. Hatred is sustained by willful blindness and willful deafness. The deliberate refusal to hear the testimony of those who have been harmed, to see the humanity of those who have been dehumanized, to acknowledge evidence that contradicts comfortable prejudice. Henry's principle names this refusal as the deepest form of perceptual failure. Not the inability to perceive but the decision not to. Matthew Henry was born in 1662 in Broad Oak, Flintshire, Wales, the son of Philip Henry, a nonconformist minister who had been ejected from the Church of England following the Act of Uniformity of 1662, one of approximately 2,000 clergymen who refused to conform and lost their livings as a result. Matthew was educated privately, studied law briefly, and then followed his father into nonconformist ministry, serving a congregation in Chester for 25 years before moving to London shortly before his death. He is remembered primarily as the author of Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible, a 6-volume expository commentary that was begun in 1704 and completed posthumously by other writers, and that remains one of the most widely consulted biblical commentaries in the English language more than 3 centuries after its composition. Henry's observation about willful deafness and blindness is drawn from his reading of the prophetic tradition in Hebrew scripture, particularly Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who repeatedly confronted a people that had the capacity to hear and see but chose not to. The prophet's frustration was not with people who couldn't understand, it was with people who understood perfectly well and refused to act on what they understood. Henry recognized this as a permanent feature of human psychology rather than a specific historical pathology. The mechanism by which people protect comfortable beliefs from uncomfortable evidence is to decide, before the evidence arrives, that they will not receive it. The willful refusal precedes and prevents the perception. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Distinguish between the inability to perceive, which deserves compassion, and the refusal to perceive, which deserves honest challenge. 2. Examine personal areas of willful blindness and deafness, the places where the decision not to see or hear has been made in advance of the evidence. 3. Recognize that the willful refusal to hear the testimony of those who have been harmed is among the most serious forms of complicity in the harm. 4. Practice the discipline of active, open reception, choosing to hear and see what is inconvenient as an ongoing commitment rather than a situational response. Matthew Henry's commentary was written in the context of a religious tradition that had been deliberately excluded from public life by law. The nonconformists who had been ejected from the Church of England were legally deaf and blind to the established institution that had rejected them. Henry wrote from that margin, and his commentary is remarkable for its consistent attentiveness to voices and perspectives that the mainstream tradition had chosen not to hear. He had learned from his father's ejection and his own marginalized ministry what it cost to be on the receiving end of willful deafness, and he responded by becoming one of the most careful listeners in the history of biblical commentary.
Quote 14.6. Modesty is the only sure bait when you angle for praise. Lord Chesterfield, 1694 to 1773. Quote definition. Those who seek recognition and admiration most reliably attract it not by directly claiming their achievements, displaying their superiority, or angling visibly for approval, but through the counterintuitive instrument of genuine modesty, which disarms competitive instincts, invites generosity, and allows others to arrive at admiration on their own terms. Quote application. Authentic leadership, the kind that genuinely influences rather than merely commands, works through the modesty that invites rather than the arrogance that demands. For anyone sharing wisdom, building community, or trying to persuade others toward kinder and wiser ways of living, Chesterfield's counterintuitive principle is the practical guide. The modest presentation of genuine substance attracts more lasting admiration than the loudest self-promotion. Philip Dormer Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield, was born in 1694 in London into one of the most prominent aristocratic families in England. He was educated at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, entered the House of Commons at 20, succeeded to his earldom at 29, and spent the next 40 years as a diplomat, politician, wit, and man of letters whose reputation for elegance, intelligence, and social mastery was unmatched in his era. He served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Secretary of State, and Ambassador to The Hague, and was known as perhaps the most accomplished conversationalist and social performer of 18th century England, a description that made his most famous work both natural and somewhat ironic. That famous work, The Letters to His Son, published posthumously in 1774, was a collection of private letters written over decades to his illegitimate son Philip Stanhope, instructing him in the arts of social performance, diplomatic skill, and worldly success. The letters are simultaneously a masterwork of practical social intelligence and a document that has made many readers uncomfortable, because their frank discussion of social manipulation seems to contradict the genuine wisdom they often contain. The observation about modesty is characteristic of the letter's best quality. It is not moralizing advice, but strategic observation. Chesterfield was not prescribing modesty because it was virtuous, but because it worked, because he had watched people angle for praise their entire careers, and observed that the ones who got it most reliably were the ones who seemed least to want it. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Recognize the counterintuitive dynamics of admiration. Those who seek it most visibly tend to repel it, while those who display genuine modesty tend to attract it. 2. Develop the discipline of allowing work and character to speak rather than claiming their quality directly. Let others make the discovery. 3. Distinguish between performed modesty, false humility deployed as a social tactic, and genuine modesty, which reflects actual security in one's own substance. 4. Apply this principle to leadership specifically. The leader whose authority is acknowledged voluntarily, earned through demonstrated competence and genuine modesty, commands more durably than the leader who demands acknowledgement. Lord Chesterfield's own reputation suffered a devastating blow when Samuel Johnson, whose dictionary Chesterfield had nominally patronized, but largely ignored during its composition, published his famous letter rejecting the belated praise Chesterfield offered after the dictionary's success. Johnson wrote that he had been excluded from his patron's door and could not now accept the honor of being introduced as his patron's dependent. The letter is one of the great assertions of independent dignity in English literary history, and it demolished Chesterfield's reputation as a patron in a single paragraph. Chesterfield's failure, in that instance, was exactly what his own principle warned against. He had angled for the praise of association with Johnson's achievement without having put down the right bait.
Quote 14.7. The first man gets the oyster, the second man gets the shell. Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. Quote definition. In competitive environments, whether commercial, intellectual, or social, the advantage of being first is often decisive and disproportionate. The first mover captures the substance. Those who follow inherit the depleted remains. Timing, initiative, and the willingness to act before conditions are perfect are therefore not merely advantageous but often determinative. Quote application. For the mission of making America wiser and kinder, Carnegie's principle is the case for acting now rather than waiting for better conditions. The opportunity to reach people with wisdom before hatred, cynicism, and ignorance have fully calcified in their thinking is an oyster available to those who move first. Every delay hands the shell to someone else's initiative. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, the son of a handloom weaver whose trade was being destroyed by the Industrial Revolution. The family emigrated to Pittsburgh in 1848 when Carnegie was 13, essentially penniless, and Carnegie went to work immediately as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory for $1.20 per week. He subsequently worked as a telegraph messenger, a telegraph operator, and then a railroad executive, where he demonstrated such exceptional organizational and financial ability that he was put in charge of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division in his mid-20s. He then built a steel empire through a series of moves: vertical integration, the Bessemer process, ruthless cost control, and an almost preternatural sense of timing that made him the richest man in the world by the early 20th century. Carnegie's oyster principle was the operating philosophy of his business career. He consistently moved before his competitors thought the moment was right, acquiring ore deposits before the demand for steel justified their price, building rail connections before the traffic volumes warranted the investment, adopting new production technologies before their efficiency was fully proven. He was right enough often enough that the pattern became self-reinforcing. His early moves created the competitive positions that made subsequent early moves possible. He got the oysters. His competitors got the shells. After his retirement from business in 1901, Carnegie spent the rest of his life applying the same first-mover principle to philanthropy, building over 2,500 public libraries before public funding for libraries became conventional, establishing educational institutions and research foundations before the necessity of doing so was widely recognized. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Value timing and initiative as competitive advantages that are available to anyone willing to act before conditions are perfect. 2. Resist the paralysis of waiting for certainty. By the time certainty arrives, the oyster is usually gone. 3. Apply the first mover principle to wisdom and kindness. The person who reaches out first, who speaks truth first, who extends generosity first, captures the relationship advantage that waiting forfeits. 4. Recognize that the shells available to those who move second are not worthless, but the oysters available to those who move first are consistently more valuable. Carnegie's most revealing philanthropic first move was the public library system. He had educated himself as a boy partly through a private library whose owner, Colonel James Anderson of Allegheny, opened his personal collection to working boys every Saturday. Carnegie never forgot the gift of that first access to books, and he spent $60 million building public libraries across the English-speaking world before governments thought to do it systematically. He got there first. The oyster of public literacy, the transformation of a generation's access to knowledge, was his to give because he moved before anyone else decided it was their responsibility.
Quote 14.8. Insults are the arguments employed by those who are in the wrong. Jean-JacquesRousseau 1712 to 1778. Quote definition. When a person or position lacks the substantive argument to defend itself, the resort to insult is the reliable fallback. It shifts the contest from the merits of the position to the character of the opponent, replacing the argument that cannot be won with the attack that does not require winning. The presence of insult is therefore diagnostic. It signals the absence of sound argument. Quote application. Hatred communicates almost entirely through insult. Dehumanizing names, contemptuous labels, degrading characterizations, because hatred has no sound argument to offer. Rousseau's diagnostic principle is the tool for recognizing this. When the response to evidence, reason, and the claim of human dignity is insult, the insult itself is the admission that no better response is available. The mission of replacing hate with wisdom offers what insult cannot: actual arguments. Jean-JacquesRousseau was born in 1712 in Geneva, the son of a watchmaker whose wife died 9 days after his birth. He was raised partly by his father and partly by relatives, had an unsettled and largely self-educated childhood, and arrived in Paris at 30 with little formal education and enormous intellectual ambition. He won the prize of the Academy of Dijon in 1750 with his discourse on the sciences and arts, arguing counterintuitively that the progress of civilization had corrupted rather than improved human morality, and spent the next 3 decades producing the most influential and most controversial body of work of the French Enlightenment, Discourse on Inequality. The Social Contract, Emile, his treatise on education, Julie, his enormously popular novel, and the posthumously published Confessions. Rousseau's observation about insults as arguments draws from both his philosophical analysis of social dynamics and his own deeply personal experience of public controversy. He had been the target of sustained, vicious attacks from almost every direction, from Voltaire, who despised him personally and attacked him publicly, from Hume, who had sheltered him in England and then accused him of paranoid ingratitude, from the authorities of France, Geneva, and Berne, who banned and burned his books, from the philosophes he had broken with, and from the public that simultaneously lionized and tormented him. He had observed at close range what people did when they could not defeat his arguments on the merits. They attacked his character, his appearance, his legitimacy, his sanity. The insults were the evidence that the arguments had landed. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Treat the receipt of insults, especially in response to reasonable arguments or claims of dignity, as diagnostic information. The insulter is telling you they cannot win on the merits. 2. Resist the temptation to respond to insults in kind, which accepts the terms of a contest that the insulter has already admitted they cannot win fairly. 3. Recognize that insult-based discourse, the dominant mode of online hatred and political contempt, is structurally an admission of argumentative defeat dressed up as aggression. For apply Rousseau's diagnostic to public life. When a position, movement, or person consistently responds to challenge with insult rather than argument, they are broadcasting the weakness of their case. Rousseau spent the last years of his life in genuine paranoia. He had been persecuted so thoroughly and by so many people that his sense of being surrounded by enemies was largely justified, even if his responses were sometimes disproportionate. He died in 1778, 2 months after Voltaire, the man who had attacked him most viciously. The Social Contract's opening line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," went on to inspire the French Revolution, the American Constitution, and virtually every democratic movement of the subsequent 2 centuries. His arguments outlasted every insult directed at him. Rousseau's principle proved itself in his own life. The people who were wrong about him reached for insults. He reached for arguments. The arguments won.
How they work together as a unified philosophy to replace hate and guide a life with motivational education for all. The Lead Authentically Framework. Courage Layer. Timeless Bravery and Self-Educated Judgment. Quotes 1-2. Thackeray. Establish bravery as the permanently fashionable virtue. Needed in every era, available to anyone, never outdated regardless of what cultural trends surround it. Twain. Insist on genuine self-directed education. The development of actual judgment and wisdom, as distinct from and sometimes in opposition to institutional schooling that prioritizes compliance over understanding. Together, define the foundational qualities of authentic leadership. The courage to act rightly regardless of fashion, grounded in genuinely self-developed judgment rather than institutionally approved opinion. Thackeray ensures that authentic leaders never calibrate their courage to what is currently celebrated. Twain ensures that their judgment is actually their own rather than a credential-seeking reflection of approved thought. Together they describe the leader who can be trusted, brave enough to act and educated enough to act wisely. Character Layer. The Cost of Undisciplined Desire and Its Discipline. Quotes 3-4. Cooper. Name the inevitable consequence of pleasures pursued without moral examination. Remorse hatches from the egg that pleasure laid, as the cautionary mechanism that makes the discipline of desire necessary. Locke. Identify the discipline of desire as the background process through which genuine character is built, not in exceptional moments, but in the daily, unglamorous practice of choosing what is right over what is immediately wanted. Together, provide both the warning and the remedy for character formation. Cooper's remorse principle shows what happens when desire goes undisciplined. The egg hatches eventually, and the remorse it produces is more durable than the pleasure that laid it. Locke's discipline principle shows what to do instead. Build character in the background through the patient, daily practice of desire disciplined by values. Together they describe the complete character formation cycle. Understand the cost of undisciplined desire, then do the background work of disciplining it. Perception Layer. Willful blindness and genuine modesty. Quotes 5-6. Henry. Name the deepest form of perceptual failure, the willful refusal to hear and see, as a chosen strategy rather than an involuntary disability, and therefore as a moral failure as well as an intellectual one. Chesterfield provide the counterintuitive social insight that genuine modesty, the absence of the pretension that willful blindness often accompanies, is the most reliable way to attract the recognition that pretension demands and repels. Together, address the perceptual and social dimensions of authentic leadership simultaneously. Henry's willful blindness is the failure of the inauthentic leader, who refuses to see what contradicts their position, while Chesterfield's modesty is the practice of the authentic one, who has no position to protect and therefore no incentive to refuse uncomfortable evidence. Together they describe a leader who sees clearly because they have nothing to hide, and who is recognized precisely because they do not demand recognition. Action layer, first mover initiative and argument over insult, quotes 7-8. Carnegie, assert the decisive advantage of timing and initiative. The first mover captures the oyster, as the practical principle that converts authentic character and genuine wisdom into actual impact. Rousseau, provide the diagnostic that distinguishes authentic argument from the insult-based discourse of those who are in the wrong, a distinction that both guides the authentic leader's own communication and helps them read the quality of opposition they encounter. Together, complete the framework with its practical operating principles. Carnegie ensures that the authentic leader acts on the courage, character, and clear perception built in the previous layers, not waiting for perfect conditions, but moving first to capture the opportunity that passivity forfeits. Rousseau ensures that the authentic leader's action takes the form of genuine argument rather than insult, and that when insults are the response received, they are recognized as the evidence of the opposition's weakness rather than its strength. Together they describe the authentic leader in motion, moving first, arguing honestly, reading opposition accurately.
Free easy extra advantage math, spelling and reading workbooks you can download for free at stop2think.com or buy at educationstopshate.com. Free easy math wisdom workbooks with octo repetition to grow math self-confidence. You'll get plenty of repetitive practice of age ranges and averages of our 52 teams of 8 quote authors. Free easy alpha cipher-coded puzzles teach letters, numbers, and phrases using antique wisdoms that encourage and educate. Can you decode this cipher quote of encouragement using either our learning to spell or just for fun instructions? And since time is money, practice reading faster with 52 teams of antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate, and entertain generations for centuries. We offer printed versions and timed videos with background music. Sign up for free weekly emails of 52 teams of antique rival wisdom workbooks with easy math, spelling, and reading practice. And, if you'd like to get paid for sharing our wearable wisdoms, keep this in mind. Everyone I know wears a shirt, and most of us change them daily, so change your shirt and change the world. Social equalities are blatantly subliminal antique positive wisdoms repetitively shared without saying a word. This applies to all our wearable shareable wisdoms. Like pretty witty baby onesies and baby tees that you and others will see and read multiple times a day. The same is true with pretty witty kids, but they'll also share these wisdoms with anyone that can read at daycare or school. Youthful truths let your kids gain confidence sharing antique wisdoms with their friends. Imagine them sharing words of wisdom with classmates and teachers. I think, therefore I think tees I wear is a super easy way to share words of wisdom that have passed the test of time. Our social equalities help make us all wiser and kinder with blatantly subliminal messages promoting a more fair and equal opportunity society for all. And don't forget our giftwisdoms.com for birthdays and holidays that makes it easy to share the wisdom with clothing, coffee mugs, and magnets. So do the future a favor by encouraging, educating, and entertaining with words of wisdom that have passed the test of time to make us all wiser and kinder. With wearable wisdoms to fit babies, kids, and adults. You can clothe a whole family, city, or state. Join the 52 of 8 today.